Railroad engineers, have you ever come across anything creepy or weird on the tracks while driving your train? Friend of the family is a now retired railroad man. He was in a caboose during World War II on an ammunition train when it exploded and he somehow got out alive. Another time very close to the same place of the explosion they had to stop the train one night. The engineer called back saying they were going to be there a while so he could get off and stretch his legs. He did just that and stepped off a bridge and fell about 20 feet and broke a leg. I was volunteer fireman. 110 below 0 day we were called to a body on the tracks. I expected a body in 5 or more pieces. He was rolled up in a ball instead. He had been there all night. Wonder how long it took to thaw him out. Second body on track. He was in at least 5 pieces. Thought it was an accident but letter was found in his home saying he was going to kill himself. I'm no engineer, but I saw a Domino's delivery guy make a delivery to a train that had been at a crossing for an hour or so. I'm not a train engineer per se, but I've spent lots of years working on the signals of the East Coast. I'd say one of the most interesting things I've seen are the villages of people that really pop up in the right spots. Tons of people, dogs, homeless villages with friendly people who aren't afraid or embarrassed ever at all. Also, in some mountain towns of West Virginia, there are some unique folks with tracks running through their properties. My grandma grew up with train tracks just feet from her front door. Train tracks in the front yard, the big sandy in the back, are Kentucky. Working in a tunnel with 2 other colleagues one time and we all heard a woman screaming down the tunnel. Like in the films when a woman sees a dead body or a man with a gun, kinda loud hysterical screaming. 2 of us start sprinting towards the noise and after 5-10 minutes we realize there is nothing there at all. No noise or sign of people. We are so sure we heard screaming we go to the next station supervisor who informs us there is absolutely no one working around that was close enough for us to hear. We were in the deep underground section and we all heard that same noise that was creepy. Had heard a colleague speak about walking alone in the tunnels, again away from all the people close to him on the night, and hear someone whispering and another colleague hear chains at an abandoned station. I'm not a supernatural person but have no reason to doubt these guys' stories as they were told to me one-on-one. Very quiet when you're on your own underground so could be mind playing tricks I guess but still a creepy experience. Also, to lighten up the spookiness, there are a few women who actively flash train drivers from their houses that back onto the train lines. Never seen any of them but been in a cab with different drivers talking about it happening. The whispering is probably easy enough to explain. Human brains are great at pattern matching recognition. If there's enough low-level random background noise from echoes and such, our delicious brains will try to form it into something recognizable. Kinda like people seeing Jesus in toast. So never worry your tasty brain and deserted tunnels about it. It's definitely not zombies. A large part of my family works for the railroad and here is what I've heard. Not all creepy but scary. 1. My dad, who is a no-nonsense 6'6" man, came home one night after a derailment and was white as a sheet. He told my mom he met a man walking away from the derailment, which was in the middle of the woods. He didn't think it was too weird because some people check out wrecks and derailments. Anyway, my dad gets to the derailment and says hey to my uncle. The cause of the derailment was a truck that had been hit and then pushed by the engine. Now, none of this is weird until my dad sees the man in the truck. It looked like a beat up version of the man he met on the way to the derailment. He got the man's driver's license when the sheriff's deputy showed up. The way my uncle put it was your dad almost passed out and had to sit down. He didn't say why because you don't do that around railroad men. 2. My uncle was walking the rails, which you do to prevent derailments and such, and he had to pee, so he went into some woods. He said he walked up onto what he was sure was some kind of animal sacrifice weird crap. He called the other workers to see it and they were very creeped out. They just left and tried to make a joke of it. 3. The number of drunk hobos homeless people who pass out on the rails is oddly high. 4. Also, a hobo was found dead in a hopper car, the kind that are open and typically hold grain. They figured since it was the summer he wanted more air circulation and hopped in that one. Well, the car was filled and no one really looks in it. It wasn't figured out until the car was unloaded. My brother-in-law oversees the maintenance of all kinds of trains. I asked him this very question a while ago. He said that all sorts of weird crap ends up on the front of trains. Most notably, he once had to remove a human head embedded in the front. Where the rest of the body is, we'll probably never know. My dad works on the trains in Northern California. Quite a few years ago, the foreman of the shop told him to check out the underside of the train and clear any debris. Wild dogs frequently get hit by the trains and can sometimes cause problems. A few minutes with a flashlight and my dad sees part of a skull with long brown hair attached. Turns out the train had hit a drunk from a nearby homeless camp that had passed out on the tracks, and the wild dogs kept getting hit because they were eating the poor bastard. Well, I'm not in the railroad industry, but my buddy is a conductor, and while he was driving his train, a girl ran out of a chapel in her wedding dress right onto the tracks. And well, you know the ending. He was in therapy for quite a while. I looked everywhere in my drive for the photo, but I can't find it. I was working at a BNSF railway in Stockton, CA, maintaining the cranes that pull cars off the tracks when a freight engine rolled in with the front end a little caved in, covered in red. But the entire front end was covered in what appeared to be red bloody chunks. A paste left over from rolling through maybe a herd of cattle, or a horde of zombies. I didn't know what to think. I felt my stomach churn, and my co-worker turned green and heaved a bit. I asked the foreman what happened. He told me some teenager jumped out in front of it. Later, I grew a pair and walked up to it as these folks were cleaning it without any signs of being affected by the sight. Turns out the train hit a stalled fiberglass trailer filled with tomatoes that was headed to the Hunt's Cannery in Oakdale. Best friend works as an engineer conductor track inspector for a small railroad. Not anything scary, but the worst I heard about is when one of the elevators they work with had a silo explode while someone was on top of or in it. I don't remember which. Also, the stories of workers slipping and getting run over by the train, not doing things safely, tend to scare the daylights out of me. One time they caught a kid dragging his bike across the tracks, underneath of the train. They only saw him in the mirror when they started to move and he scurried out, and the head guy hopped off and chewed the kid out. Class 1 freight conductor. A few things. 16-year-old with his head and shoulders 50 feet up the track, with his body laying beside the track next to us. Friday night yard job, we saw two males freaking in the middle of a tunnel, just crap-faced, trying to wave us by like we were not a train on tracks. Just laid on the whistle until they left. I remember recrewing a train that had killed someone, and spending an hour looking in the bush for their hand. I didn't find it, then stepping in something that was red with hair. Going north, we hit a moose, not too far from the bunkhouse. Called up on the radio. Someone came down and grabbed it, cleaned it up, and we all ate it that night. I'm sure there is more, but it all blends in after a while. Takes a lot to stand out. Weird, yes. I was privileged enough to see the locally famous pounder. We're traveling down the tracks when my engineer spots a dirt bike up ahead by some large bushes. How that's weird. No one around. As we are both looking out my side of the cab, we get to the other side of the bushes and lo and behold, there he is in all his glory, wearing nothing but riding boots and beating off as furiously as no man should. I'm not talking self-love here either. I'm talking power beating it like it owes you money. As an added bonus, he was bending over and slapping, playing with his butt too. So that was nice. Worst part was we were on a 10-mile-per-hour slow order, so we couldn't even make a fast escape. It was one of those sights that's so horrifying you can't look away. Somewhat relevant. I am a station attendant. I have a few stories. Found a dead kangaroo on a train, so I had to lock off the carriage to the train. Had to stop a transgender lady from being on the tracks who was attempting to commit suicide. I think it was a bad breakup. Trains were cancelled so she wouldn't be hit. Managed to calm her down and convinced her to get up and call a friend to meet her. Had to stand in the way of a deranged woman who threatened to jump in front of a train until the police arrived. Had a homeless person steal an artificial plant after I stopped him from breaking into one of the station shops. A lady's handbag managed to pull an escalator step out. She wanted her handbag damages to be paid by the rail company. We said only if she paid for the repair of the escalator. Lots of freaking and adult toys in strange places. I have two stories. 1. I work in the electric traction department of Amtrak in the Northeast. One night we had a report of wire theft in a remote location along the Harrisburg Run, and we were sent out to investigate. Typically the work crews get there before the police, so we'll usually hang back a bit until the men with guns get there in case the perpetrator is still there. We show up and see some wire hanging and some guy laying on the ground. We assumed he hit a live wire, got fried, and now dead. We walk up and shout to the guy, but we don't get a response. After about 10 minutes, the police show up and start taking pictures of the scene. One cop grabbed a stick and poked the dead guy a few times just to make sure. No movement. Definitely dead. The cop with the camera takes a picture of the dead guy. When the flash goes off, the dead guy jumps up, screams the loudest scream I've ever heard, and takes off running. The cop with the stick starts chasing after him with the stick above his head, while his partner and our crew just stand there trying to figure out what the frick just happened. 2. I was on a standby crew at night during a storm with 2 other guys. I was put on a piece of equipment called a cat car, while the other 2 guys decided to hang out in the truck, with the cat car running to keep it warm. I decided to lock up and take a nap. I locked both doors with padlocks on the inside so there was no way anyone could get in without me letting them in. A few hours later I awoke to some heavy wind and decided to check with the other guys to see if our supervisor had called with any trouble. When I got to the door, the lock was missing, but I couldn't open the door. The same with the other door. I called the other guys to come help, and when they got there they asked how I managed to lock the cat car from the outside. If you're not quite following that, the padlocks that were originally on the inside, locking the only 2 doors into the equipment, were now on the outside. The 3 of us couldn't figure out what happened, but it creeped me the frick out. My grandpa was a train engineer, and the weirdest story he told me was when he was driving a train somewhere through Alabama and saw a dead body on the side of the tracks. He said the man looked homeless and had severe facial damage and was laying by the tracks covered in blood. He did call the police but said he heard nothing of what happened after. In my short career of 6 years working in Australia, the only thing that amounts to anything remotely funny was when I hit an emu in the outback. It's not strange to hit a few kangaroos or goats, but this day an emu stepped in front and it exploded into feathers. I mean, they went everywhere, around the door frames and stuck in the windscreen wipers. It's hard to put into words, but thinking back, it was a had to be there moment. Automated rail track inspector here. I have worked on inspection vehicles all around the world, and actually have not seen as much weird stuff as some people who've already commented. The weirdest for me was on a track in Philadelphia. I was riding with a TME on the rear deck. He was a really cool guy and was pointing out all the landmarks next to the track. Mostly these were Rocky references, but I hadn't seen the film in ages and the locations were lost on me. We were driving up and down the same stretch of track all day, near the Rockies gym if I recall correctly. It was really run down, and it looked like we were driving through a landfill site with all the city rubbish just poured down the embankment. On this trip the TME was watching out and was uncharacteristically quiet. Out of nowhere he shouts to the driver to sound the horn, and out of nowhere all these cokeheads just appear. There were guys walking around spaced out, women with their boobs out, needles hanging out of arms, that type of scene. That sight really messed with my head. It was the lowest form of humanity. I asked the guy WTF. He said that around this time each day the dealer visits that area, so all the homeless guys living in that crap get their high on. Women and men will do anything to get their hands on that crap. They sound the horn so that they can see the people, who usually get up and start walking about. If they didn't, they worry that a high hobo will just walk out in front of them. Now, here's the weird crap. We entered a tunnel, and at the other end the land is cleared out, and there are allotments up the embankment. For like 500 meters past the tunnel the land is all clean and organized and marked out with crops and plants growing. There are guys standing watching us pass holding pitchforks and other gardening equipment. The TME explained that these were pensioners from the same project. They cleaned up the land and used it to grow crops and food. They were standing by the tunnel to guard from the cokeheads on the other side. Best and worst of humanity separated by a tunnel. Not a railroad engineer, but the last time I went on a train, it was from Seattle to California. On the second night, we suddenly stopped and were waiting for a while. Apparently there had been a naked woman running along the train track and laid down and let the train go over her. I looked out the window after we stopped and heard the news. Well, sure enough she was outside, looking right at me. I was 10 and I was scared as frick. I worked as a general laborer at the port over the summer helping move rail cars filled with grain. The cars in the port move pretty slowly compared to when they're out traveling the countryside, but that makes incidents that do happen all the more terrifying. The only incident I saw with my own eyes was a rat get pinched under a wheel and have its left side burst open and its entire insides popped out and land next to the track still in rat form. Other incidents at the port that I've been told by the regulars that have worked there for 50 years. Worker was walking to work one day, early morning shift, so it's still dark out, and tripped over something. Looked down and saw a severed human head just staring blankly up at him. Turns out some guy had committed suicide by jumping off the overpass into the oncoming train, and parts of his body went everywhere. Another guy committed suicide by laying a small red towel down over one of the rails and laying on his back, face up, with his neck over the track and arms crossed across his chest. Then he just waited for a train to come. They found him in the morning, and he hadn't moved an inch. This is part of the track where the trains go pretty slowly. He definitely would have felt it for a split second at least. On a lighter note, there was apparently an infamous train tagger that would graffiti trains with comic strips so that you could watch the trains go by and read the comics. My uncle was an engineer for years. He said that severed limbs were a very commonplace find on the tracks. He also said that when hitting cows you just ducked below the windows and would wait for the unfelt pop, like a big meat-filled balloon. Second engineer on intermodal freight trains between South and West Australia for 4 years. Highly remote part of Australia with extreme temperatures all year round. Most unusual things I have witnessed. 1. Thousands of dead kangaroos. 2. Aboriginal communities living off the grid and naked. 3. Weird flashes of light. Multiple colors. 4. Cars dumped on the track, which we have no choice but to hit. 5. Large commercial plane with no decal in a very unusual spot. Desert basically. And yes, like others have said, drunk men passed out near tracks. The creepiest thing we found was probably a jawbone. Yes, it was human. Been there for a while. Likely from a suicide. Oh, and also a dead cat that had got caught in the cable run. Working on London Underground, you don't really find much creepy stuff. It's mostly just stories people spread around about ghosts and stuff. And plenty of corpses and or body parts. We often got called to incidents to make sure no bits of bone were going to block up points. I worked in a rail yard. Not out on the rails themselves as an engineer or conductor, but we saw a few interesting things. My buddy saw what he thought was a black garbage bag laying inside the well of an intermodal car. We have to remove any debris, as the shipping containers won't fit in properly. He reached in to grab it and quickly pulled it up only to discover it was a dead vulture. Feathers fell off, and he dropped it and began screaming and running down the tracks. I was hysterical. I told him he still had to get it because it was on his side of the train. Best story though was working the overnight shift. Train came in and was parked. A few hours later I see a disheveled man walking around looking lost. I had heard stories that we occasionally still get hobos riding the rails, and this gentleman was my first. Official railroad policy is to call the cops and have them arrested for trespassing. But the unwritten rule was if it appeared they were not trying to steal or vandalize anything to just escort them off property. I asked the guy if he's looking for the exit, and he said he was. I pointed it out to him and he thanked me. He turns and says, "Hey man, where the heck am I? I've been riding the rails all day. Fell asleep. I had to get the heck out of Baltimore." I looked at him and said, "Baltimore?" He looked confused. Apparently he got on the train at the rail yard across town, rode over to a classification yard, fell asleep, and woke up in our yard across town. 6 hours and he had gone about 5 miles. He was peed. I was trying not to laugh, as he was muttering to himself out the gate. I am a freight conductor. We hit a young lady walking between the 2 main tracks at like 5 in the morning. That sucks and dead bodies are creepy on their own, but the craziest part was that I thought we hit 2 different people. The woman that I saw was white heavy set and in her late 40s. She was walking toward the train leaning out in front of us. When myself and the brakeman walked back to find the woman, what we found did not match what I saw. She did not go under the train, so she was mostly in one piece. We found a Latin woman who was very thin and I later found out in her early 20s. Now I thought I was crazy, but the brakeman started asking me if we had hit 2 people and described the woman in her 40s the same as I had seen her. Needless to say, we only hit 1 person. He and I were convinced that this young girl was possessed by some evil entity. The face I saw before we hit her still pops into my mind occasionally. It was evil, twisted and full of pain. I work in association with NS, but not for them per se. One day we get a call saying there was a man trapped in a train car that was locked in there for 2 days. We thought they were kidding until our manager called us to go have a look. We get out there and found out the guy was a hobo from the other side of the state. Some kids forced him on the train and locked him in. Former Gandhi dancer, track repairman. For the CN here, there is some pretty weird crap out there depending on what cities you run through. Mostly bodies, human or animal. One derailment I was called to was because someone had lit about 100 feet of track on fire and damaged the ties. When the train passed over, it pulled the spikes right out and the rails flopped over. Also, I was on site when a washout happened. We were there because the ballast was old and not draining correctly, and as I drove the truck over a section I looked out to see the whole embankment just slide out from under the track. Nature is a scary bee. Also, I've become really good at telling what animal a ribcage belongs to. Now I have a desk job. Sometimes I miss the field. My father-in-law is an engineer for MRL Montana Rail Link. Guy has seen the most gnarly stuff. He's seen people commit suicide by laying down on the tracks well after the train could ever think of slowing down. He said it just rips them apart like a nonchalant tear in a shirt. He's seen bears and bison and elk and kinds of wildlife get exploded not paying attention or freezing on the tracks. Worst part is that he and the crew have to do cleanup and police reports. Conductor of passenger rail here. Now that means I don't see nearly as much railroad as engineers freight conductors, but I've seen enough. There isn't so much as creepy anymore because a lot of things that happen up there are so common, i.e. hitting people, hitting every type of wildlife ever, and seeing people where you never thought someone would be at 3 AM because they like trains. The only thing that still makes me uncomfortable, other than trespasser strikes that are kids or non-suicides, is when it's super foggy out. Now when visibility is limited and you're still going 70 plus into a wall of fog, I have to leave the head end. It's something about the speed and not knowing what's 100 featuring ahead of you and having full faith in the signals and equipment. My dad was a special agent, detective. People stealing the signal wire were a big problem. Sometimes they would cut the wrong wire and he'd have to call someone to recover the body. Once Casey worked, thieves would wait at the base of a mountain for the piggyback train. When it slowed down, they would jump on and go to the UPS trailers and just start throwing packages out. Then go by later and pick them up. You'd be surprised at the things shipped UPS. Machine guns, for example. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.